Welcome back to the Vanderpod, the axial and additive podcast of Vandersnatch Books. Those are math adjectives, and I'm not sure if I used them right. We are a small press publisher of treasures found off the beaten path for lovers of all that is good, true, and beautiful. I'm Carolyn Claire Givens, and today I'm talking with Mark Forrester about sharing our passions with others through stories. Mark, welcome to the Vanderpod.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Mark, you are one of our authors, but I would love if you could start with just a quick introduction of yourself to our listeners, and then we'll talk a little bit about your book too.
Sure thing. I currently live just outside of Spokane, Washington with my family, married, 3 children. I'm a high school teacher. That's my day job at a classical school. I've now been teaching in the classical tradition for 11 years. Besides being a teacher, I'm also a captain in the United States Army National Guard and also a volunteer firefighter in my district.
Yeah, so you're not busy at all. You're not doing anything. So you are the author of Above Not Up, which is a novel for teens that we published in November of last year with Bandersnatch. So can you tell me a little bit about Above Not Up?
Absolutely. So our world is three-dimensional, but in mathematics, there's room to imagine higher spatial dimensions. So basically, the premise of the story is if a fourth spatial dimension existed, and I'm not talking about a fourth dimension like time. Physicists like to use time as the fourth dimension, but I'm talking about a fourth spatial dimension. Say one exists, and say there are beings that live in that fourth dimension. We would have no idea that they exist because everything that we perceive is only in 3 dimensions. But what if a creature of the fourth dimension were to visit someone in our world? And that's basically the premise for the story. There's a high school gentleman, a young man, Roscoe, and he gets visited by a higher dimensional being. And the story basically just explores what that would be like, what would become possible, and shenanigans ensue, basically.
They do. They absolutely do. And I think just in the big picture, this idea that there is more beyond what he can see, that Roscoe, his eyes open to our own world in new ways because of that. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. I mean, just with our interactions with other people, what we see is never what we get. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, you've never met a mere mortal. Just the person sitting next to you is infinitely more complex than what you can perceive at any one time. And if just our material world is that intricate and beautiful and complex, how much more so would a potentially higher spatial dimension be?
Right. So we have used the term mathematical fantasy as we are describing Above Not Up. So how do you define that as a genre?
Yeah, I imagine it's not a genre that has a whole lot of books in it, but it is, I would say that it's something distinct from, say, science fiction. Science fiction looks at or imagines some advancement in the natural sciences that makes something really cool possible. Mathematical fantasy would be more like taking a wild, imaginative idea within the realm of mathematics and trying to incarnate it. The closest thing that I've seen novels that talk about mathematics. There's one about the Goldbach conjecture, which is really interesting. But the closest thing to a mathematical fantasy might be the work by Lewis Carroll of Alice in Wonderland, who, if you aren't aware, his real name is C.L. Dodgson, and his day job was being a mathematician at Oxford University.
I think I knew that. That's so cool.
Oh yeah, and in his spare time, he would go to the parochial school across the street and teach their mathematics classes and play math games with them. But when you read Alice in Wonderland, there are a lot of hilarious things, not just, crazy characters. There's a really fun critique of education systems, but also there's a bunch of math jokes sprinkled throughout it. And I'm not sure, I have to go back and check, but I think there might even be one section where the space that they're occupying is hyperbolic space. And what would it be like to actually live in that space, hyperbolic space? So that was a very long answer. To put it more succinctly, mathematical fantasy then would be taking a creative idea in mathematics and trying to incarnate it with real characters and narrative.
Okay. Can you explain to me what hyperbolic space is?
Yes. Okay, if you ever seen a Pringles chip,
Yes.
if you lived on the surface of a Pringles chip, the shape of your space is curved.
Okay.
And I mean, obviously, we live on a sphere. So, strictly speaking, spherical geometry should work for us in our world. But it's so big that locally, Euclidean geometry, which is just kind of planar geometry, the world is locally flat. So,
Right.
Euclidean geometry works really well when we're like building houses or streets or what have you. But if the space you live in is curved according to a hyperbolic curve,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of really fun things happen. First of all, if you have a straight line and a point not on that line, in Euclidean geometry, you can draw exactly one line through that point parallel to the first one.
Right.
Sorry, if this is
No,
getting too.
that's making sense to me.
If I wish
If
I had a
I'm
whiteboard or
tracking,
something.
somebody else is.
in, but in hyperbolic space, there's an infinite number of lines you can draw through that point, distinct lines that are
Mm-hmm.
all parallel to that first line,
Oh,
which is
okay.
which is weird because the shape of space is curved.
Okay.
What is a straight line? If you were to actually walk the path, you're not walking the same kind of straight line
As we
that would be
understand.
analogous to planar geometry.
Yeah.
My last or one more thing that I think is kind of the most interesting is that because the shape of space is curved, there's more space. So like if you're walking through the woods and you go some distance and you make a right turn and you go some other distance and you make a right turn, make a third right turn and you walk the same distance every time, you're going to end up back where you started.
Yes. Reliant K taught me that.
That's right. Three less make a right. But in hyperbolic space, there's room for a fifth right turn.
Okay.
Or if you were to define a square as all equal sides with right angles,
Uh-huh.
then a square in hyperbolic geometry has five sides.
Okay.
That's just it's just really weird and it's really
Right.
counterintuitive and it's
Right.
the way you would interact with the world would just be so different. It would probably make us a little nauseous if we were like plopped into that world. So yeah, that's a very quick explanation of it. Just some of the cool things about hyperbolic space.
Okay. That is
That was a lot. Sorry.
no, 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 no. This is good. See, I tracked with you for most of that, but I have a confession. I'm not great with numbers. Like once we move past counting beans and counting blocks I basically started faking it in math. And later we got to a point where my school said to my mom, she's been faking it. So here's grades 1 through 5 math books. Take her back to the beginning and help her actually understand what she's doing. So please do not ever ask me to add, subtract, multiply. I don't even try to think about division. But, but I do love math theory. And I love when I have friends who are into math or this conversation here today, when I hear them talking about kind of that higher math concepts, I may not understand in the sense that, you do. Um, but I get enough of it and I capture enough of it that it just sort of gives me something to reach for and I get excited about that. And there's something about, and I do this with a lot of science fiction as well, something about that like, oh, here's this concept that's just beyond me that I feel like is the moment that you get just a glimpse past the veil of our reality and into God's reality. And I think that's so cool. So, in your acknowledgments of your book, you wrote that you would like to express your gratitude to authors Dr. Paul Lockhart and Matthew Parker, whose work declares unequivocally the true nature of mathematics, that it is a creative art form with resplendent beauty, contrary to the tragically drab, lifeless husk that most people encounter in school. So, tell me what is going on, a little bit, but what is going on beyond the arithmetic of math?
Yeah, just to your experience, I think that's really lovely. It's not unlike somebody who's not necessarily a literary major or what have you, encountering a poem and just finding it delightful.
Yes.
They may not be able to, they may not know everything about that poem or that author or the time period or whatever, or all the technical terms of meter,
Mm-hmm.
But if you wanted to spend your life studying this,
Mm-hmm.
you could. And I think for the most part, our society doesn't really know what mathematics is,
Mm-hmm.
or more importantly, what a mathematician does.
Mm-hmm.
If I said, like, oh, I study literature at like a party or something, everyone could come up with a follow-on question of like, oh, who's your favorite author? Is there a time period, right? There are questions that, because we recognize literature as a legitimate art,
Mm-hmm.
and even if you don't know anything about it, you could ask a question to carry on a conversation to avoid awkward pauses. Or if someone said like, I'm an artist. Oh, what medium do you like to work in? Do you
Mm-hmm.
have a favorite artist? What do you like to paint typically? But if I was at a party and I said, oh, I'm a mathematician. Oh, so you like numbers or something? like we would draw a blank. Like we don't even know how to. We would just hope that someone calls our name in the next room and we can get out of there. But we just really don't know what a mathematician does and we've lost sense of what mathematics is. But
Mm-hmm.
that's really it. That mathematics is a creative art form, and it's just as creative endeavor as poetry or art or music, and just as mesmerizing.
Mm.
Usually, the first day of my math classes, I'll ask my students, "What words would you use to describe your previous math classes up to this point?" And usually, they're all thinking the same thing and afraid to say what they're really thinking. So I help them out, and I say, "All right, how about this? Raise your hand if you would describe your math classes or your math experience as boring, tedious, uninspired, a
Mm-hmm.
waste of time,
Mm.
boring." Oh, sorry, I already said that one. And every hand is up.
Yeah.
And I was like, all right, good. All right, keep your hand up if you describe mathematics as beautiful,
Mm.
mesmerizing, psychedelic. Every hand drops down. And it's like, good. You just told me that you've never had a mathematics class.
Huh.
Because if beauty isn't the first word you use to describe math, then you don't know what it's about.
Right.
And this makes a lot of sense when we're talking about architecture, the visual arts, dance, music, literature, poetry. But we expect those things to be beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
We don't expect math to be beautiful because, frankly, most of us have never seen it.
Mm. Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no,
Okay, good.
absolutely. And that's, yeah, I mean, clearly you're one of those people who loves mathematics and loves sharing about that with people. I mean, you are a teacher after all. So for you, as you said to yourself, by Jove, I'll write a novel. Um, how did that love of mathematics translate into telling a story? Like, what is the story of that for you?
So one of my favorite tutorials to do is exploring the fourth dimension
Hmm.
and a fourth spatial dimension. And we look at what that space would be like. And it's an absolute blast to teach it, to introduce it to students. They also have this like fear that, wait, this is actually really interesting and beautiful. I'm afraid that maybe I'm not doing math, and like, no, this is the real thing. But I've never had a student not be enraptured by contemplating what a fourth spatial dimension would be like.
Okay.
And when I had this idea, it was basically a version of a book called Flatland, but one dimension up. In the story of Flatland, a three-dimensional solid, a sphere, visits a two-dimensional creature. And so it's like, well, what if we did something like that? A four-dimensional being coming to a three-dimensional creature like
Hmm.
ourselves. And the process of creative fiction and mathematics really aren't all that distinct. Because again, I would posit that they're both creative art forms. I've been writing since I was in sixth grade. It's my favorite thing to do in my spare time. And one of the great things about writing, about sub-creating, is that once you dream up a character, you can't do whatever you want anymore. Like
Mm.
if you are a good enough writer, once you dream up that character, they have a certain personality, and how they act in situations is kind of out of your control.
Hmm.
Like a real person with free will, you just and like a lot of authors describe this process as they dream up a character and then they just kind of record what they see their characters doing.
Hmm.
But a bad writer forces their characters to do certain things, and
Hmm.
we've all probably had that experience of like whether it's in a TV show or in a story of like, I know this character, they would not have said that or they would not have done that. This is a weak point in the story. Like we have a sense for that. And it's very similar for mathematics. Once you dream up a crazy idea, it's kind of out of your control at that point. All you can really do is just kind of see what your creation is up to.
Hmm.
So I like to use that analogy of like we're going on kind of an adventure like into the wild. Let's see what we can find. Let's see what we can dream up. But that's what mathematicians do. They have these wild ideas and then they just kind of follow them logically and kind of see what they're up to. They might dream up a pattern and then just see where it goes. They can't force math to do their bidding.
Hmm.
All they can do is discover something beautiful and watch what happens.
That's so cool. So I remember at one point in the editorial process, we had some things we asked you about, and one example that came to mind as I was thinking about this was you had a teenager named Barbara, and we were like, that doesn't seem like a teenager's name in, our modern era. And so in response, you said, well, she's named after Saint Barbara and told us about her. So I would love for you just briefly to tell our listeners who is Barbara,
Yeah,
the real one.
the real one, yes. So Barbara is a Christian martyr from the third century. But long story short, she became Christian when it was, not the coolest thing to do. When her father found out, he was very irritated and actually chased after her to kill her. She ended up getting away, but then ultimately she was captured and was beheaded. And if I remember right, he actually did the execution himself. And the story goes is that after the execution, her father and another person who was involved were struck dead by lightning, kind of on the spot, as kind of a very public declaration that like you done messed up. And for that reason, she is the patron saint of field artillery. And so I mentioned before that I'm an officer in the United States Army, and my branch is field artillery. And so there's a whole St. Barb's guild. So I love her for her field artillery connection. But she also has this early association with number and just seeing the significance of particularly the number 3 with the Trinity. Her father built this bathhouse, and originally the plans had just 2 windows. But then while he was away on a business trip, she convinced the builders to add in a third window because she wanted a trinity of light to be coming into this bathhouse. So it became a really cool place to go visit. But again, her father was not pleased, and then the rest of the story goes through. So like her early association with number and raining death from the sky, I guess, makes her this double patroness of mathematics and field artillery. She was so much in love with our Lord that she wanted to give her whole life to him, and then ultimately she did.
Yeah. So that conversation that we had led us to ask you to write some end notes for Above Not Up because you had so many more things than we noticed because we are not mathematicians that are Easter eggs essentially for mathematics, for other interesting historical things like the story of Barbara. So as you were writing, as you were creating the story, was including those things always a very deliberate choice? Like, oh, I want to include St. Barbara because, or did they come naturally out of your story because they're the things you're interested in?
Like they started off as just kind of just for me. Like I did not expect anyone to ever get them. That the name Euler is probably means nothing to most people. And like there were other little jokes like that were really for the writers group that I was part of when I was living in New Hampshire. Like some jokes for very specific people or just little jokes for me. It wasn't deliberate,
Mm-hmm.
but I hope other people enjoy these other silly jokes.
Yeah. Well, it was such a delight discovering them once you pointed them out. When you pointed out what it is, and I'm trying to remember Blaze. Blaze is the name of the dog, and
Pascal.
you said, reference
Yeah.
to Blaise Pascal. And I was like, oh, I totally see that, like get that reference when you pointed it out, but it's spelled differently. So as I read it, I wasn't thinking Blaise Pascal. And so I love that we were able to include those things. It makes us open our eyes to the delights that are throughout the book and that are, again, back, it's doing what your book is doing or what your characters are doing is, they're opening their eyes to the world around them. That was really, really neat.
That's really cool. I'm glad to hear
Yeah,
that.
it was so great. So, okay, before we get to my last question, I do want to add in one here. Back on the conversation of mathematical fantasy as a genre. Would you consider Madeline L'Engle's books to be in that mathematical fantasy, like A Wrinkle in Time, for example?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
The women, they're fifth dimensional beings, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what allows them to do all these things. And they do visit that world where they're flattened out. And I actually really did enjoy later when they get to the father, and it's just like, oh, they can't get to him because
Right.
he's in a four-dimensional prison. They will never get in there. They just can't. And I thought that was such a cool thing. Like, I'm able to geek out on it. And for a reader who doesn't pick up on those things and it still makes sense, I think I would
Mm-hmm.
probably put that more in the mathematical fantasy category rather than science fiction. Fair
Yeah,
enough.
because I mean, as you just listed things there, I kept thinking, oh yeah, and this and this. I do think one of the things I love about Langle is her never-ending fascination with the fields of mathematics and science, and fields that were not her area of study, but she would hear. I
Mhm.
think it's in Walking on Water. She talks about a line from an article or a reference to a star that was something along the lines of a red dwarf sitting on a horizontal branch. And she's like, that is a line directly out of fairy tales. But it was talking about a star and talking, and her just never stopping, never ending wonder
Yeah.
at the world we live in. And
Mhm.
it is a wondrous place.
Yeah. The world is charged with the glory of God. Like, the world is way more strange and wonderful than we ever could have imagined.
Yeah. We'll follow that up with your novel, Above Not Up. How do you hope that it impacts your reader?
The hope would be that a reader would, first of all, just enjoy the narrative kind of on its face, but then realizing that it's charged with these mathematical themes, hopefully disabuse them of the idea that mathematics is not just about following directions, right? And it sounds like that's about the time when you stopped being interested in mathematics, because that's usually how it's presented to us. Like,
Mhm.
here's an equation. Here's how you solve an equation, whatever solving it means. Here's how you get X by itself. Like, why do I want X by itself? Why doesn't it want friends? Anyways, but like, most of mathematics is presented as just, here are the mechanical operations,
Mhm.
do them flawlessly, or you
Mhm.
get no credit. And like, no other art form is treated like that.
Right.
If you're writing a poem, what's the next right word? That is not a matter of mechanics, it's a matter of inspiration and artistic intuition.
Mhm.
If you're making a painting, how do you know what's the next brushstroke? That's a matter of imagination and intuition. Same thing for making music. When it comes to mathematics, if all you see is just following directions, it is extremely boring and it's uninspired. Most of the time, people don't actually get to see the mathematics kind of in the raw. In other words, they don't really get to play.
Mm.
Imagine if you had to go through 12 years of school where for one of your classes you just had to study the rules of soccer,
Mm.
but you never actually played the game.
Mhm.
All you did was study a set of rules for years. If you graduated high school and someone said like, "Oh, do you like soccer?" You'd be like, "I'm not a soccer person." And you'd be wrong because you don't know what soccer is. You've never actually played the
Right.
game. But like, we don't realize that like all we're making students do is study a small set of rules and repeat them over and over again. They never actually get to play. Imagine if your art class was just studying color theory and you never actually put pen to paper or
Mm.
brush to canvas.
Mhm.
That would be tragic.
Mhm.
And we would all know that something's wrong with an art class where you're not making art.
Right.
But nobody thinks there's anything wrong with a mathematics class where you're not doing mathematics.
Yeah.
And so like the hope of the book is to be a fun introduction to a single mathematical idea of a fourth spatial dimension. If people could see that there's more, that their intuition is right, that there's something more to mathematics, that there is some beauty in
Mm.
it, that it is really like every other art, a way to see the world differently. And if we could chase that and stop just doing these vain repetitions, we would have an idea of what mathematics is, and we would be better off because we'd be cultivating that side of our humanity that's built for mathematics because we're geared for beauty, and
Yeah.
that's all mathematics is exploring beautiful patterns and ideas.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. All right. I want to move into the popcorn questions. I'm going to ask just a few quick questions. I'd love your gut answer. You don't have to think too hard about these. So, first off, and this one has a little backstory in that we say we publish treasures found off the beaten path, but our shorthand way of saying that is we publish weird things that are adorable. Um, so, what is a weird thing that is adorable in your life?
Besides my children,
I
or
mean, it can be your children.
uh, uh, they are they are absolute weirdos, and you find yourself saying things that you never in a million years would have dreamed that you would say, like "stop licking her elbow," like, and yet you just can't help but love them. Like they just melt my heart every single day. They just have to like give me one smile, and my day's better.
I love it. I love it. What is your favorite writing tool that you use to write with, whether
Yeah,
that's something physical or digital?
I actually find it very difficult to type as the initial kind of medium.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I write, I always have to write by hand first, and I like these precise pilot pens,
Mm-hmm.
black if I'm doing writing, in a look term notebook,
Okay.
and then if I type it up, that's kind of like a second draft.
Yeah.
But there's something about that process of actually doing it out by hand that I can't write a sentence, or I can't write anything long form unless it's mechanical through like with my hand in a pen.
I love that. What is your favorite genre to read?
Is just gothic a genre enough?
Yeah.
Well, like my two favorite authors are Fyodor Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor. I mean, I think Gothic and Russian is probably synonymous, but and then Flannery O'Connor is kind of in that Southern grotesque or Southern
Mm-hmm.
Gothic with Percy and Faulkner and
Yep.
Hemingway. So if the term Gothic can encompass both of those spheres, then that would be my answer.
I like it. I like it. And then last one, what do you think is the most interesting mathematical theorem that you know of?
Ooh. Can I tweak it just a little bit to be like
Go for it.
maybe mathematical plaything?
Okay.
Pascal's triangle basically, I feel like every time you meet a mathematician, you could ask them, what's your favorite thing about Pascal's triangle? And they would have a new thing to say. The more I study it, the more I teach it to my students, the more I find. And even they find things that I haven't noticed before. But there's so many really wonderful patterns in there. There's powers of two, there's triangular numbers, there's Fibonacci numbers. It's just the more time you spend with it, the more you see. And I mean, I feel like that could be said about any great work of art, that the more time you spend with
Mm-hmm.
it, the more time you look at it, the more you see. But this one has the advantage of going on forever.
I love that. I love that. Well, Mark, thank you. Before we say goodbye, I want to tell our listeners about our next big project. We are about to launch a Kickstarter for a poetry collection that is full of fun and whimsy and heart. It's called I've Got a Bad Case of Poetry, and it brings together the delight of words and rhythm and rhyme and images. And our hope is that it will help instill a love of poetry in kids. There's going to be about 170 poems from over 60 poets. And the entire thing is illustrated by Emily J. Person. We've got over 100 fully illustrated pages, and they're incredible. It is edited by our own lover of words, Rachel S. Donahue, our poet in residence over here. And I really think it is destined to find its place among the classics of children's poetry anthologies to delight a new generation of readers. So, listeners, you can help us bring it to life by pre-saving the Kickstarter, which is going to launch on February 18th and finish on March 11th. So we'll have a link in our show notes, and then you can also find it on our website or in our social media. But I just wanted to make sure to tell everybody about that. So as we Get ready to say goodbye, Mark. Thank you. This has been so much fun and so interesting for things that I had not heard of, and also just, reminding me, I think, of the things that do delight me about mathematics when I'm not having to wrestle, you know, for X, um, or whatever that is. So thank you. Thanks for being here. So,
Yeah,
listeners,
thank you for having me.
yeah, absolutely. So, listeners, may you find bookish treasures in your wanderings off the beaten path. Thanks for listening in to our conversation today on the Vanderpod. We hope you'll check out our full catalog at bandersnatchbooks.com. The Vanderpod is produced by Rachel S. Donahue, A.B. Donahue, and Carolyn Claire Gibbons. Audio engineering by S.D.G. Morgan. Artwork by Evelyn Warnamendi. Many thanks to our friend Chris Slayton of Son of Laughter for our theme song, Cricket in a Jar. Find links and more in the show notes.